I'm excited for the days where, our cycling advocates have, we've gone from sharrows, which were just marking in the lanes, to striped lanes that were really unprotected. And now we're at like another stage of real protected bike lanes where it would take some work for a car to get into a bike lane that's up on a curb. And I'm excited to see what the next iteration is of that, as well as on the bus lane side, where now we see some signs and sometimes some great red paint or red aggregate, and sometimes the red paint is a little questionable, and it is hard to figure out, can I turn in this lane or not? But what will the next design iteration be of bus lanes, and will it be more protected to really give bus priority where it should be?
Well, hello, and welcome to this GBH News Forum produced by the GBH Forum Network, GBH News and Transportation for Massachusetts. I'm Bob Seay, GBH News Transportation Reporter, and I've been moderating a series of 4 webinars about the future of what we call mass mobility. Well, tonight is our stop number 3, and we'll be discussing how to make room for all riders on our streets. In the last 2 years, 183 communities here in Massachusetts have created 310 projects with what's called the Shared Streets and Spaces program, while several cities and towns have established new dedicated lanes for buses and bikes. Well, what have been the results? Who wins and loses when we reallocate our limited pavement? And what should we expect in the coming years? Those are the questions we'll be examining tonight, along with any of those that you send along to us. Well, before presenting our panelists tonight, I'd like to give the mic over to Josh Ostroff, Interim Director of Transportation for Massachusetts, who has been our active partner on producing this series. Josh.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's a pleasure to be with you again, and I'm very grateful to the GBH Forum team and to our panelists for participating in this conversation. Transportation for Massachusetts is a statewide coalition of more than 100 member and partner organizations, and we're working towards a more just and sustainable, equitable, and safe and modern transportation network to serve everyone in every community. We are particularly interested in this topic because it gets to the heart of how we need to transform mobility in Massachusetts in order to better serve the people and set us up better for the future. We've got a number of members who work on these issues, and a number of our some of them are represented here tonight. But what's most interesting is this concept of trade-offs that we'll get into. How can we prepare ourselves for a future where transportation really is here to serve us all? So I'm very grateful to you and your team and our panelists. And back over to you, Bob.
Our panelists tonight include MilNeil, Editor-in-Chief of streetsblog.org, Lisa Jacobson, who is the Senior Program Officer for Mobility at the Barr Foundation, Elijah Evans, Executive Director of the organization Bikes Not Bombs, and Jay Monty, Transportation and Mobility Planner for the City of Everett. Welcome to you all this evening. Well, one of the things the pandemic did was to clear our streets of cars. And when people experienced what that was like and what they might be able to do with that space, they're asking the question, why do we have to give it back? I mentioned that today in New York City, they announced a plan called 25 by 25, which is to take 25% of the street space in New York City and turn it over to bikes, buses, and pedestrians and parks by the year 2025. So we'll see how they do with that. First, I'd like to talk to Lisa Jacobson from the Barr Foundation. Tell us a little bit about the Barr Foundation's involvement in transportation issues, but specifically about the polling you've done that indicates what people like to see with their street space.
Great, thanks. Thank you for having me too. We are very fortunate at the Barr Foundation on our climate team to do grant making to reduce emissions from transportation while centering equity at the same time. We do this in a variety of ways, most notably supporting some incredible advocacy organizations, communications work, research, pilots, and other creative ways to give transportation the attention it deserves, which is pretty exciting. And one of the things that we do support is polling work. What does the public think about a particular topic? What does a particular segment of the population think about a particular topic? And throughout the pandemic, as shared streets and outdoor dining and repurposing our streets for uses other than moving cars and parking cars, we did a poll. We partnered with the MassDOT polling group to commission a poll last summer about in Greater Boston to understand what Boston area voters really thought about these changes to our streets. And it was pretty cool. Sometimes, you need a little bit of good news, especially during COVID. And voters overwhelmingly said, yes, we're okay with taking away space for cars on our street, for outdoor dining, for bike lanes, for wider sidewalks. Very, very cool. And really a reaction to, I think, what they were seeing on the streets.
All right, Lisa, thank you very much for that. And of course, the pandemic did allow us to move into the streets with restaurants and bike lanes and different pedestrian configurations to make it safer for people. So that was an important thing as well. I'd like to turn now to Christian MilNeil of Streets Blog. You have kind of a general comprehensive view of what's been going on. And you mentioned what's interesting to you has been the change in commuting patterns, which have influenced what's going on.
Yeah, I think one of the big themes of the pandemic was that there was, especially in the early days of the pandemic when most people were staying at home, some of the only users of the transportation system were what became to be known as the essential workers, the people who still had to run grocery stores and work in healthcare facilities, and do all the other things that were important for everybody else to get by. So, before the pandemic, we had a transportation system that was very much focused on and geared towards 9-to-5 office workers. The MBTA commuter rail system, for instance, was very heavily, the service was very heavily focused towards rush hour. The subway and bus systems were similarly overloaded. The schedules were very focused in rush hours. All the traffic reporting was focused on the rush hour. When the pandemic hit, some of the streets emptied out, but there were still people using the transportation system, and it became clear to transportation policymakers that they needed to be supported better, that they had bus routes that were inadequate, weren't working well, streets weren't really designed for them. So, and I think that's been an important sort of shift in thinking. And we saw it today, and the MBTA released a proposed bus network redesign, a completely new map of bus routes for the whole region that's very much focused on providing more bus service to neighborhoods like Dorchester and Mattapan and Everett and Chelsea, where there are a lot of essential workers who have been neglected, frankly, for a very long time. And a lot of street projects were also, focused on rapidly building bus lanes in places like downtown Lynn, for instance, around Lynn Common, and bike lanes around the Boston Common to help people get to work by bicycle. So I think that's been interesting to see. And I think in the long term, we are going to have a stronger transportation system because of that increased focus on essential workers and not just 9-to-5 office workers.
Thanks. And Elijah, from Bikes Not Bombs, from the cyclist point of view, what about the infrastructure changes that are being made or have to be made to make biking safer, especially for the young people that you represent?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we've learned has pushed us to advocate for more protected lanes. I think there are some parts of our communities that we focus on Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester, which I think align with what Christian was just talking about, communities that have historically been neglected. And there are some parts of our community that don't have any sort of infrastructure, protected or unprotected. And so we definitely want to start, with low-hanging fruit, but also, as Lisa had talked about, leading with equity, right? Looking at the places where you could get the highest impact for little effort or investment. But I think in an ideal world, protected bike lanes is the way to go. And I think looking at models for what that looks like in places like Cambridge or Somerville, internationally, I think there are obviously a lot of European cities, but also, there's been a people-centered movement in Colombia and in Bogota for such a long time that I think can also be a model for centering these investments and these improvements around people.
And thank you, Elijah. And Jay Monty from the city of Everett, the first city to have a dedicated bus lane. Tell us about that, Jay. How has it been going since that? What was that, 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's been 6 years ago now, Bob. I think for us, we're a fast-growing city. We're, I think, the second or third fast-growing city in the Commonwealth, and we're also, even before that growth, one of the most densely populated cities in the Commonwealth, with some of the least transit access of our neighboring communities in the inner core of Boston. So this is really is a practical issue as much as it's an equity issue. It's also a practical issue because in order to support that growth, we have to really think about how we're going to use our street space efficiently to actually move folks to their jobs, to their school, just day-to-day chores. So the bus lane was really a reflection of all of that. It was making better use of our street space. It was addressing issues of equity by reducing travel times for folks who worked in those essential positions. And we continued to advance those projects since that first project we did in 2016. We've added close to another mile or so of dedicated bus lanes. We've added dedicated bike lanes. We're planning for future extensions of the Silver Line, bus rapid transit. All these are critical. We have 4,000 or 5,000 units of housing coming online in the next 2 or 3 years, and how we plan our streets is going to determine how those folks travel within the city. And so we have to decide through these policy decisions what we're going to prioritize and how we're going to sort of set an expectation for folks to travel.
Just a question, Jay, since Everett was the place where the first dedicated bus lane was kind of implemented, what was the reaction at the time? Did people think this was going to work or not work? Was there a reaction against it?
This was the coin we termed after the fact was called the pilot is the process. I think the trend over the years has been obviously a lot more engagement of folks in the community to get better projects, and on the whole, that's obviously a good thing. But there's also a lot of fears of what might happen when you put a project out there. One of the advantages of a quick build is that you can put something on the street that you can just easily take down if it doesn't work, and use that model as an example for folks to really kind of see, feel, touch, get a handle on what the impacts will actually be. Because too often I think fear overcomes reality. And so with the quick build projects, it allows you to say, hey, we're gonna try this out. If it doesn't work, we can just easily put things back. And so for us in that first project, putting the bus lane in, we actually didn't do a whole heck of a lot of outreach. We had done some as part of prior planning initiatives, but we were really pretty quick to put it down. But very quickly, we also collected data. We interviewed folks. We got folks from Livable Streets and the Barr Foundation and the T all helped us do that outreach during the pilot process, right? So we and it wasn't just bus riders, it was people in cars, it was people walking. And the reaction after that first day or so was overwhelmingly positive. I think in the couple of days before we rolled it out, when we first announced we were going to do it, it was quite negative, but that turned around very quickly once I think folks realized that there's quite a bit of benefit that came with it.
That's fascinating, and it's been very successful, and you've been growing it. lengthening those bus lanes. And I think other communities were watching what was happening in Everett as well. So congratulations on being that leader. Lisa, let's go back to you. You mentioned the overwhelming support people have for street changes. We should mention, we talk about the Shared Streets and Spaces program, which the Baker administration has put millions of dollars into. I don't know what the total is, but tell us about that program, Lisa. Do you think it is a good program and has been successful?
I do think it's a good program. I do think it's been successful. I think there's a link in the chat to a report that we did that doesn't evaluate this program per se, but kind of talks about the impacts of the changes to streets that communities have made across Massachusetts, and both what people think about them and also what changes they've had on safety and travel speeds and access to different things. The MassDOT Shared Streets and Spaces program, it's been, I think, of $33 million in the past now almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years, I think, next month, which is pretty phenomenal. And I think a great use of even some of the federal funds and state funds that have been that have come to the state during COVID. There's a lot to be changed here. Of course, we have very old streets that often, and as we saw on the bus network redesign today, we haven't had a new bus network in decades. It's time to kind of keep up, right, with the 21st century and really centering what people need on their streets today, not what they needed on their streets a couple generations ago or even last generation, but communities across the state, what do they need today? The real exciting thing I think about this MassDOT program is that these were relatively small dollar transportation grants from $5,000 up to $500,000, which maybe for some of our bank accounts, that's a lot of money. But for transportation projects, that's a pretty small amount of money. And it was pretty phenomenal to see what communities could do with cones, with Jersey barriers, with paint, with signs, some other maybe more complicated projects, kind of moving curbs around or something. But it's pretty cool to see nearly 200 communities out of 351 across the state take advantage of this program and really respond to community needs through the pandemic.
And it is being continued, right? I think they're still accepting grant applications.
So the latest round is closed, and I believe award announcements will be coming soon. I'm not sure about the future of this program, but I think it is really highly regarded, and I hope it continues.
Well, as we mentioned, there are several uses on our streets, and they're competing in a sense. So, Christian, can you comment on who's winning and who's losing in terms of this competition?
Well, I don't actually think it's a zero-sum game. I think it's important to bear in mind that for the past 80 years or so, we've had transportation policy has been overwhelmingly focused on probably our most expensive and least efficient form of transportation, which is moving individual people around in these massive machines, 2-ton machines. So, it's easy to improve on that, right? Obviously, there are a lot of problems associated with a car-dependent transportation system. Like it's not safe, it's boiling our climate, it's eye-wateringly expensive, and it's straining our public finances. So, and it's wasting a massive amount of time for people who get stuck in traffic every day. So, I think there is a perception. Well, there's definitely a perception among people who are sort of used to that status quo that, they hate sitting in traffic so much that they, any perceived threat that might make them, the idea that they might have to sit in traffic for even more time is very unattractive to them. But I think one of the things that especially these shared streets and spaces, as Jay was saying, the sort of quick build experimentation allows people to see, try it out, street reconfiguration, and see, actually the world isn't coming to an end if we try something different. And in fact, what we're seeing is that the streets are actually functioning a lot more efficiently because buses aren't getting stuck in traffic, and people on bikes can feel more safe and are more visible in better bike infrastructure, and people who are walking on foot aren't scared to cross the street. I think there's definitely a lot of media coverage on the conflicts and specific individuals who are like very upset about specific projects. But I think as Lisa's polling has shown us, in the long run, these projects are popular. And I think the other thing is that, people have sort of accepted this condition where our streets have been given over to motor vehicles for so long, for so many decades, that a lot of people have forgotten that these are actually public spaces. Our streets belong to all of us, and they're literally owned by the public. So they don't have to be these terrible sources of pollution and traffic violence. We can actually create public spaces that are more attractive and safe and more conducive to walking and biking and transit.
Yeah, I think safety is really the primary consideration when you start, trying to integrate all these uses on a street. Elijah, for the bicyclists in Boston, you mentioned that, your members of your organization do not feel safe. What can be done? But is infrastructure the only solution to this, or what else do you think might be able to be done?
In terms of increasing safety, I think infrastructure, I think is just the beginning. I think certainly there needs to be better relationships built between communities and the institutions that are designed to serve them. Particularly, I know we talk a lot about police and community relations, and I think there's no time like the present to try out new ways of doing things that we've done for such a long time and aren't serving our communities. So infrastructure, I think, is a great place to start, but certainly not the end. I think it's easy to start there. But for us, I think there also needs to be, and then I mentioned relationship building. That's definitely critical. There definitely needs to be a shift in culture. I think Christian hit the nail on the head in terms of how pervasive car culture is in America. I think we engage with young people primarily throughout our programs and offer them an alternative to getting around the city, one that's more affordable, one that's environmentally sustainable. But it's still, I think, pretty common for young people who we work with when they're 16 to get their license, to spend all of their earnings in getting their first car. I think figuring out a way to address or undermine this pervasive car culture can be really effective if you start with young people, because that's where it begins. And I think we're making a dent, but it takes a huge effort, I think, for us to make it a more sustainable effort.
Thank you, Elijah. And speaking of safety, I know this is a big consideration for pedestrians and cyclists and anyone who uses our streets. They say it's getting more dangerous. There's more speeding. How do we approach that problem? Jay, I'd like to turn to you in Everett. Obviously, you live in a densely populated city with a lot of traffic and a lot of those same hazards as you're trying to change your street infrastructure. What are some of the ways you address that?
It's a really difficult problem, and it's in many ways institutionalized through design standards, through just not beyond culture, but we have one of the big problems we have actually is public safety vehicles. When you think of a fire truck, and I was just talking to one of our fire department staff the other day, how fire trucks keep getting a little bigger and a little bigger every time they get by in a truck. It's a little wider than the last one and a little longer. And when we design our streets, one of the big challenges is that you have to nobody wants to impact public safety. Nobody wants to impact the ability for emergency services, for transit vehicles to quickly and safely get to a person in need. And in many respects, these are the types of vehicles that we're designing around. We make our streets wider, our curbs bigger to accommodate these things. But the side effect is that we're creating faster streets. It becomes more comfortable to drive quickly down these streets. And so there's a very much a conflict when we go to redesign our streets, even with a lot of the quick build type of projects. We still need to accommodate a lot of these larger vehicles because by law we're required to, and just out of a matter of public safety, we kind of ought to, but that leads everybody else to be able to speed. So it's a difficult problem, difficult not to crack. There are certainly ways to work around it. Narrowing lanes. We've deployed a lot of raised crosswalks, speed bumps, and those types of things around the city. But it's a real challenge, particularly on the bigger arterial roads where they're 4 or 6 lanes wide. It's very difficult to bring down vehicle speeds to where they're really safe for other users. I think that's why it's important to have protected bike lanes and facilities that are really physically separated and protected for the more vulnerable users, because that's really the safest way to get those folks away from traffic, away from the larger vehicles.
Thank you, Jay. And Josh, do we have any questions that you'd like to throw in here from any of our participants?
We've had some great questions, Bob. Thank you so much. So bringing a couple of them together, we've had a couple of folks ask about e-bikes and what the possibilities are for more people using them and what that will mean for our infrastructure. So thanks to Ann and Sam for introducing that topic, which I should add, the legislature is poised to bring e-bikes out of the shadows and into the mainstream along with many other states. So we may see even more e-bikes in the years to come. So what does that mean for how we share our streets, and particularly in more congested urban areas?
Who would like to answer that?
I'm a huge advocate of e-bikes. I actually, my family, I have 2 young daughters, and we use an e-bike to take them to school and to daycare, or to their grandmother's house on the other side of our city. It's basically a family car for us. It's a tremendous, I think when I first had kids, people knew me as someone who didn't like to drive, and they sort of said, "Oh, you're gonna get a minivan now." And because of e-bikes, I haven't had to do that. It's been really fantastic. And I think I think the thing about e-bikes is it really does make bicycling more accessible to a lot more people, to parents, to older folks, even to some people with disabilities who might not otherwise be able to ride a bike on their own. And it also just makes it possible to bike more places without breaking a sweat, cover longer distances. So I think it's a tremendous technology, and I love mine. And if anyone's curious about e-bikes and what it might be like, I strongly encourage them to try one out.
No, Elijah, young people may not need the electric assist, but what is the interest? And, the cost is considerable. So especially in the communities that you represent, I know there's a bill that would provide some rebates, but that's an issue as well, isn't it?
Yeah, affordability is a huge obstacle for many of the communities that we serve, many of the participants in our programs, our customers. We just started to sell e-bikes in our bike shop, and it's introducing new challenges and opportunities. I think we want to certainly provide affordable options, and it really starts in the 1,000 and up range, and hopefully we can lower that over the years. Services, I think a big way that we can make a difference is providing our shop services to communities in the southern part of the city, and in our strategic plan, we hope to expand shops in Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester. And I mean, when you think about a bicycle, at some point you need to bring it to get repaired professionally, and to not have a shop exist in any of those neighborhoods is inequity. I can't think of any other word to describe it. And then on the training side of things, we are we're partnering with the city of Boston to implement a pilot training for e-bikes for our young people. I think it's a huge job opportunity. I think training opportunity as the industry kind of moves in that direction. I think people are going to need to look for a place to get that professional training and the jobs to come out.
Wouldn't e-bike sharing also work in your community as opposed to having everyone own their own bike, right? You could actually,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know MassBike is doing some piloting work around making e-bikes more accessible, creating opportunities for folks all across the Commonwealth to test them out, right? I think some of it is just trying it out and kind of experiencing the experience that Christian described of realizing the power that it has in replacing the amount of car trips that you do. So it's exciting to think about the potential it has.
I'm going to bring up a touchy subject, and that is enforcement. You know, keeping cars out of bus lanes, keeping cars out of bike lanes. Obviously, you know, there may not be enough public safety personnel to do this job. So what about that challenge of, you know, every day on Twitter, we see cars lined up in bus lanes. People don't seem to either care or be conscious of it. So whoever would like to comment about that, the challenges of enforcement and maybe some of the ways of improving it.
I can comment a little bit on that. It's done at an insignificant cost. I mean, just enforcing the bus lane for 6 hours, that's a couple of shifts of personnel, and that's an expense that falls back to the city. And you know, we're fortunate in Everett that we're generally able to cover that. But as you think about expanding the system, you know, that's a real challenge. And so I think this does get back into the idea of design too. A lot of times with the quick build and some of the huge proponent of quick build, those are probably the harder projects to enforce because they aren't as permanent, they aren't as, say, protected from traffic. So, you know, when you think of kind of the best of kind of the bus lane system we have now is Columbus Ave in Boston. That's a facility that is much easier to enforce because it's less desirable, or it's harder for a motorist to sort of find their way into that traffic. Same with a protected bike lane. If it's protected off the street, that's up on up on the curb, there's not an enforcement issue there, whereas there's definitely an enforcement issue when that bike lane is just simply painted on the street. So, you know, I think it's absolutely a challenge. It's a cost that we cities have to account for, but it also should encourage us all to think about how we design beyond that quick build to make it so it's not a burden to try and enforce these things.
Is it a cultural change as well? People have to actually learn to recognize bike lanes. Maybe it might seem obvious to us, but not to other people.
I think, unfortunately, the culture on our streets generally is one that's sort of a not quite a free-for-all, but it's certainly each person for themselves sometimes. And look, I mean, you know, people jaywalk and people you know, run red lights on their bikes, and there's certainly a much worse consequence for a vehicle running a red light than there is for a pedestrian and a cyclist, and that's its own issue. That I think there needs to be a change in how we enforce one over the other. But I think, you know, when folks are trying to, you know, get to work, they're trying to get to school, and it's busy, it's congested. We all take chances. We all do things we probably shouldn't do, and you know, it does come back to design. The ability to do those things versus not do those things is a factor in that.
Anyone else like to comment on the enforcement issue?
Totally concur with Jay that this is a lot of this is a design issue, and as much as we can take enforcement, especially when police are doing the enforcement, out of the equation, the better. And I'm excited for the days where, you know, our cycling advocates have we've gone from sharrows, which were just marking in the lanes, to striped lanes that were really unprotected, and now we're at like another stage of real protected bike lanes where it would take some work for a car to get into a bike lane that's up on a curb. And I'm excited to see what the next iteration is of that, as well as on the bus lane side, where now we see some signs and sometimes some great red paint or red aggregate, and sometimes the red paint is a little questionable, and it is hard to figure out, can I turn in this lane or not? But what will the next design iteration be of bus lanes, and will it be more protected to really give bus priority where it should be?
Well, not to defend motorists, but I must admit, driving through any city now, you really have to pay attention to what's going on the pavement. Whereas years ago, you just drove down the lane. Now there are bike lanes and bus lanes coming in and out. Is there a problem that there's no standardized design for these lanes? Is that an issue that may confuse motorists, and can that be addressed at all?
I don't think it's a standardized. We have standardized designs in many respects for these facilities, but I think it's the interaction of the facilities is there's never a one size fits all, right? There's never especially in a place like Boston where our street grid is older and probably less organized than maybe a newer city, and it's always those points of interaction where you have a conflict between modes that will continue to be a challenge for not only motorists but for cyclists as well, because no matter what mode you're in, you want some regularity, some ability to anticipate what's coming next. And much as a challenge for motorists, it can be terrifying for somebody on a bike or somebody walking if they can't anticipate what somebody in a vehicle might do next. And so it's difficult to standardize, especially around here, and it's something that we all have to get better at designing, I believe.
Galatia had his hand up just
yes. Good.
Yeah, thanks for that, Christian. I definitely want to second what Lisa said about taking police out of enforcement. There's lots of ways that we can address that. Oh my God, I'm slipping on the second thing. I'm so sorry. All right, please come back to me.
We will.
I just have something to add to that too. There was a pretty interesting public health study that came out, I think last summer, that actually found that police, that there was no relationship between how many traffic stops police made and actual safety on streets and how many crashes there were. So, I think there's a lot of evidence out there that police enforcement doesn't actually work very well. In the Boston area, I know there are these weird arcane distinctions between, I think city officials from BTD can write tickets if you're actually stopped in a bus lane, but if your car is moving in a bus lane, you have to rely on the police. So there are these weird jurisdictional issues that also create problems. Nobody really knows who's in charge. I think some of the agencies are also uncertain about who's supposed to enforce these rules. So definitely agree that design, if you can design a bus lane or a bike lane that prevents drivers from driving in them, that's definitely the best way to go.
Josh, any other questions that have surfaced?
Just to chime in real quick.
Yes, that's good.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, the point I wanted to make was about, I think you made a comment, Bob, about culture change. And I think that really, for me, speaks to how we educate drivers, right? There's no reason why there isn't more in driver's ed. And this is maybe a long-term strategy, not one that's couched under enforcement, but I think we can do a lot more there. There's lots of role play scenarios that happen in driver's ed. There's no reason why we can't incorporate ones that include pedestrians and cyclists and how to be more aware of them, anticipating some of these common occurrences that happen, but are also preventable.
Good point. Josh?
So, Bob, we had an anonymous question wondering about the cost efficiency of these projects where we are, creating bus and bike lanes, and is that giving us good bang for the buck compared to other investments that we make with scarce transportation dollars? Might be a good question for Jay or someone else.
Yeah, I would say generally yes. You look at the cost of putting in a bus lane; it's very inexpensive at sort of the base level, right? If you're just painting a bus lane on the street, you're talking, a couple $100,000 per mile, maybe like something like that. That's certainly much cheaper than, say, light rail, which is millions of dollars per mile. The two are kind of apples and oranges. I think even certainly a light rail line versus a very base level bus lane, there's a difference in level of service. But I think it starts the conversation. It is a means of changing the discussion and the culture around it as well. So it was a big deal when we did that first bus lane 6 years ago, and it sort of set off this wave that now when you look at the facilities being built, not even in Everett, but in and around Boston, which are more expensive facilities, but they're also much more efficient facilities. You've seen sort of the culture shift and become more of the norm. people were willing to put in a little more time, money, and infrastructure to make it all work. Even at that, you're still at a fraction of the cost as a larger project. So I think absolutely, and I think it depends on how then we utilize it. I think the other half of the discussion is not simply just putting the lane on the street, it's how much bus service are we running in that lane. And I know we've talked a little bit about bus network redesign, and the MBTA committing today that they're going to run 25% more service across the system. And that's just as important as putting in the lanes, because we can speed up the buses, but we also have to increase the capacity to get that bang for the buck, to make sure we're actually moving more people more quickly.
Good point. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Well, just to follow up to that is how do you assess the trade-offs when if we putting in bus or bike lanes or combined bus and bike lanes comes at the expense of on-street parking? How do you assess those trade-offs?
All depends on context.
Yeah.
Jay is maybe going to say the same thing.
Yeah, and this is a discussion I've had directly with the MBTA, and it relates to the amount of service on a street. I think there are corridors we have that are congested and could certainly benefit from dedicated bus lanes, but the level of service of the bus is simply not there for us to be able to go to those businesses and those residents to say we're taking out parking because the bus comes once every half an hour. And so that's where we come to the other side of the equation, which is, we've had this discussion with the T. We will work towards doing more space on the street for buses, but there has to be an increase in service so that we are actually serving many more people. And there's of course no right answer to any of this. It's a trade-off politically, as a trade-off, even just by the numbers of riders and business owners. But we have to see that improvement in the bus service to go along with the lanes.
I was wondering, and I've asked you, previously about conflicts that you have experienced and how they may have been resolved, because obviously with different uses being proposed for the same space, maybe there just physically isn't enough room. So decisions have to be made about who ends up getting the space and who doesn't. Can any of you tell me a conflict that you have confronted and seen resolved successfully?
I think we've seen through the Shared Streets and Spaces program, and even prior to that, when cities were experimenting with different design changes on their street with cones and paint and signs, things that were temporary, as to Jay's point about the pilot being the process, there are examples where the pilots have not worked and the city listened and said, we're going to pull this out, or we're going to make some changes, and let's have a community conversation and talk to affected stakeholders, and maybe we're going to try it again, maybe we're going to take a little while and reevaluate. But that ends up building some trust and shows that the cities or municipal staff are listening. And we're not going to get it right the first time, but I do think all the time, but I do think that's the beauty of some of these quick build type of projects, as long as safety is the number one consideration throughout, to be able to see what works and doesn't.
That is an excellent point, Lisa, because it is a back and forth, kind of process, and one size literally doesn't fit all. So you could say, oh, the bus lane is a great idea if you start plopping them in areas, especially if you haven't talked to people who live there or use it, right? I mean, that's one of the things that causes a problem. Northampton is often mentioned. It's in the chat too. Christian put a connection into it. What's going on in Northampton? How was that resolved or not resolved? Curiously, did they go back and redesign and try it again?
They're doing a more in-depth planning effort right now, but the Shared Streets and Spaces project that they sort of tried out with paint and concrete planters, I think in the summer of 2020, got a lot of blowback. Like business owners didn't like it. People in cars had to drive slower down Main Street, which a lot of people did like, but made a lot of people upset too. So they're in the process, and they're planning to do a complete reconstruction of their Main Street in 2025. I don't know if that's still the plan. I've got to follow up on this story, but Northampton has an extremely wide Main Street. I think I've heard it said that it's got the widest Main Street in the Commonwealth. So there's lots of space there that could be reallocated and made better use of. So they're thinking about that. But I think that's a good example of a pilot that, they tried it, but because it was just paints and temporary materials, it was pretty easy to take down when it generated a lot of blowback. I think that's another thing I want to mention is that it's this whole the pandemic has also been really interesting because of how transportation agencies and public works departments and agencies like MassDOT how they've all approached public outreach for street projects. So before the pandemic, they would have public meetings that would be like in a school gymnasium somewhere at dinner time, and you might get a couple dozen people turn out. And they were usually very specific kinds of people who, had time to come to these meetings. And oftentimes they were the kind of people who didn't like things to change, right? And since the pandemic, we haven't been able to do public meetings in the same way, of course. So there have been a lot more virtual meetings, but cities and towns and the state have also been doing a lot more sort of like door-to-door outreach, going on bus rides with bus riders to meet people where they are. And personally, I think that's been a much more successful mode of outreach that reaches many more people and more people who wouldn't necessarily come to those kinds of public meetings that we had before. So, and again, as Jay said, like the pilot is process. Being able to try things out on a temporary basis and iterate and experiment, I think has also been a very useful tool to try things out.
You mentioned Northampton having a really wide street, which is ironic because most of the problems are on streets where there just isn't enough space in older New England towns. So that's a fascinating observation. And I don't know, when you get into a situation where you have to decide between business owners, well, Cambridge is a perfect example where, businesses are claiming they're going to, suffer because they don't have parking. And this is obviously something that we're kind of all watching to see how that gets resolved. But there are areas where there doesn't really seem to be enough space for everybody who wants to use it, right? So what do you do in that case?
With any good that has a finite space or resource and the demand exceeds supply, we're gonna have some issues. And our funky old street network here, that's totally the truth. And you look at other major cities around the country that have these perfectly planned street grids. I mean, there's a million of them: New York, Philly, DC, Chicago, Austin, Denver. And I get envious when I see these system-wide plans for this is a transit street and why we're prioritizing transit here. This is a bike street and here's why, and we're prioritizing bikes here. And you can kind of get to the same place within a block of each other, but we just don't have that type of street network here, which makes it exciting, I think, or it maybe means that a lot of us will have a job for a while because these challenges are really hard to solve. But I do think we could approach them a little bit more holistically and not just talk about that one parking space over there or that one block of bike lane over here, but looking at how people move around, where people need to get to, and looking at our streets as a network, not just little pieces.
Parking is a whole issue on its own, and it's being debated, and the whole zoning controversy over required parking or no parking. I mean, there was a time when you wanted to build a large building, if you had no parking, people thought that was detrimental. Now there's a consideration that maybe everybody doesn't have to have a parking space. What about the parking dilemma? What do you do about that?
So we here in Everett actually passed zoning reform related to transportation about a year ago, and it effectively eliminated parking minimums for new development. What it also did is it started to manage the on-street supply that we have. And it also sort of started sending the message that the city really shouldn't be in the business of parking. I think that's been something that, cities have been in the business of parking for the last 60, 70 years when it was believed that parking was going to, bring about a livened business community. It's going to enable downtowns to thrive, and that really hasn't been the case. In most respects, it's probably been the opposite. But in either case, the city managing the parking makes it a political issue in a way that it might not if parking was more of a maybe market-based solution, particularly on private developments. If we now say to developers, you can decide how much parking you want to build. We're not going to tell you a certain number, but know that you also have to have ground level retail if you're on a commercial corridor. Know that you also have to provide affordable housing. Know that you also have to provide green space. And so a lot of it is about level setting these other priorities that have been sort of pushed to the side because parking sort of superseded all of them. At 2 spaces per residential unit, you were pretty much eliminating any possibility of ground level retail because your entire bottom floor, if not the second and third floors, were parking. You were paving over green spaces in the backyard to accommodate parking. You were driving up the cost of units because if a structured parking space might cost $40,000 or $50,000, that's $40,000 or $50,000 times 2 spaces is adding $100,000 to the cost of a residential unit. So in terms of affordable housing, it's got a pretty detrimental effect. And we're not saying that folks don't still drive, that many folks may still want to bring a car, but we, the city, don't want to be in the business of setting an arbitrary number, particularly when doing so is going to prevent us from meeting other policy goals like affordable housing, green space, and ground level street activation.
Yeah, in terms of bike lanes, Elijah, I wanted to ask about that in terms of conflicts with parking, with people still using the cars in neighborhoods. Do you see any solution to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know what the solution is. I think in terms of our work with young people and doing community organizing, it's really focused on the process, making sure that people who are going to be most directly impacted are involved, that we take the time that we need to educate folks, to introduce our own ideas, to hear theirs, and kind of reconcile areas of disagreement. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think so long as the process reflects our values and is inclusive of the people who are most directly impacted, there's no way we're not going to come out on the other side, I think, aligned around a solution that works for the majority of folks. And it's not going to resolve everyone's concerns. But I think that's kind of how I would articulate our definition of success, that the process.
I wanted to ask you about induced demand, because sometimes I hear of a bike lane going in and people are saying, why did they take all that space? And there are no cyclists. Well, maybe there are none because there's no space to ride, right?
And there are other parts of the infrastructure that are lacking, but are required to sustain a thriving, people-centered transportation network. So like my point earlier about there not being bike shops in Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester, you shouldn't be surprised if you don't think that there are many cyclists out there. I mean, I also have heard that narrative, and I don't know how true that is. I think there are a lot of people who are people of color who are biking, but they're underrepresented or not a part of that narrative. And I want to think of ways to eradicate that, because I feel like it can be really destructive to the kind of improvements that we want to see in those communities.
We have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to go through the list of our panelists here and ask you. It obviously, the transformation of our streets is a process that's not going to stop, even if the pandemic should wane. It's going to continue as people try to maximize what they want for their main streets in their communities. So I'd like to ask each of you what you see in the future happening in terms of transforming our streets into either being more bicycle friendly, pedestrian friendly, safety oriented, or whatever. Whoever would like to go first, go ahead.
I can go first. I think the biggest change that I've seen in the last few years is the change to the process. I think many of us were working on these types of changes to our streets for many years prior to the pandemic. And what the pandemic allowed us to do was sort of bypass some of these sort of ingrained, whether they were permitting requirements or they were other types of process requirements that tended to bog these projects down. The longer I've sort of been in this field, I've sort of kept finding sort of, old laws, old rules, or simply policy holdovers from long ago that were simply barriers to change in many ways. And the pandemic, I think, forced everybody to take a step back and say, we needed to make change. We need to make change very quickly. How do we do that? And suddenly we're able to do outdoor dining because folks have decided we need to relax on permitting for outdoor space and permitting for liquor licenses and things like that. The same is true with bike lanes and bus lanes. We all sort of decided we're going to go out and make these changes easier. So my hope is that moving forward, doing these types of projects isn't such a big lift anymore, that we can do it more quickly, more cost effectively, and have a better public process for doing it as well. And I think that seems to be holding true now that we're 2 or 3 years past the start of all this.
And Christian, what do you see coming up in the future?
I mean, I'm not going to make any predictions, but I think I'm not going to embarrass myself. But
okay.
One thing I'm really interested in is the state's climate policy and how transportation, specifically cars and trucks and their tailpipes, are the biggest climate pollution problem in the Commonwealth and in New England. And it's becoming more and more urgent for states like Massachusetts. If the world is going to meet its climate goals, then states like Massachusetts really need to cut down on car ownership and car use sort of across the board, and pretty dramatically and pretty quickly. So I think that a lot of the things we've seen in the past 2 years about redesigning streets on a relatively quick timeline those are lessons that we will need to scale up and apply more broadly if Massachusetts is going to have a chance to meet any of its climate goals. So that's going to be a story I plan to watch carefully in the coming years.
And Lisa, from your perspective.
I definitely second Jay and Christian. One of the most exciting things I think might seem not as important, but is really thinking about how to embrace Boston as a year-round city. There's lots of stuff to do from now through October, and then we kind of hibernate a little bit. And our public places, our streets, where we can do things over the winter on our streets, and we can use our streets differently over the winter too. And I'm excited to see kind of where that goes and where we could take that to fully embrace where we are here in Boston.
And Elijah, you have the last word.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate everything that has been said before me. I would say what makes me hopeful is, equity doesn't just seem like a buzzword. I think it can be challenging when change as important as what we're talking about. There's a difference between what we say and what we do. And I think I'm hopeful that, we're finally starting to walk the walk. We're known for being this really liberal state, but there are a lot of things that we haven't made progress on in a very long time. And so, getting the new bus network, that's exciting. The improvements to Blue Hill Ave, and the fact that that's one of the streets that intersects Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester. There are huge opportunities there, and we just, like I mentioned, we want to make sure that change happens in the right way that involves people who are most directly impacted.
Yeah, that's going to be some project to watch, Blue Hill Avenue coming up. Listen, I want to thank you all, great panelists tonight. Christian MilNeil, editor-in-chief of Streets Blog, Lisa Jacobson from the Barr Foundation, Elijah Evans, executive director of Bikes Not Bombs, and Jay Monty, transportation and mobility planner for the city of Everett. I want to thank you for being with us tonight and providing such an interesting discussion. Have a good evening.